Good evening. Welcome to Whispered History. Tonight I want you to imagine a world before highways crossed the Great Plains, before railroads divided the horizon, and before the familiar image of the American West had ever existed. Imagine a vast landscape stretching farther than the eye can see, tall grass moving beneath the wind, rivers winding slowly through open country, millions of buffalo traveling across the plains, and scattered across this enormous world, communities of indigenous peoples who had learned to live with the seasons, the animals, and the land. Then imagine something arriving that would change their lives forever: the horse. Within a few generations, horses would transform hunting, travel, trade, warfare, wealth, and even the political balance of North America. Peoples who had once traveled primarily on foot would become some of the most extraordinary mounted hunters and horse warriors in history. But this transformation did not happen overnight. It was not simply a story of indigenous peoples receiving horses and immediately becoming expert riders. It was a long process, a process of observation, experimentation, training, adaptation, and generations of knowledge. Before we begin this journey, if you enjoy calm, immersive history that helps you relax while discovering the past, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Whispered History. Your support helps the channel continue creating long-form historical stories like this one. Now, get comfortable. Let the room become quiet and allow yourself to drift back to a time when the Great Plains seemed almost endless. Long before horses became the symbol of the American West, the plains were already home to remarkable civilizations. The peoples of the plains had developed sophisticated ways of surviving in one of the most demanding environments in North America. The climate could be unpredictable. Winters could be brutally cold. Summer storms could arrive suddenly. Drought could transform the landscape, and food sources moved with the seasons. Yet the plains were also incredibly rich. The buffalo was at the center of life for many communities. Buffalo provided meat. Their hides could become clothing, coverings, and containers. Bones could become tools. Sinew could be used as cordage, and many other parts of the animal had practical uses. But hunting buffalo on foot was difficult. It required knowledge, patience, coordination, and extraordinary courage. Hunters had to understand animal behavior. They had to know how buffalo moved. They had to recognize changes in the wind. They had to approach carefully, and they had to work together. Before the horse transformed the plains, indigenous hunters already possessed highly developed hunting techniques. They could use cliffs. They could use natural barriers. They could guide herds toward carefully chosen locations. They could hunt from foot with bows, spears, and other weapons. The plains were therefore not an empty wilderness waiting for the horse. They were already a human landscape. People understood its rivers, its grasslands, its forests, its animals, its seasonal rhythms, and its dangers. Then from the south, a remarkable animal began spreading through indigenous networks: the horse. The story of the horse in North America is unusual. Horses had ancient ancestors on this continent, but those original horse populations disappeared from North America thousands of years before European arrival. The horses that transformed the plains were descendants of animals brought by Europeans. Spanish expeditions introduced horses into the Americas during the 16th century. From colonial settlements, horses escaped, were traded, were captured, and gradually spread into indigenous societies. And indigenous peoples quickly recognized their potential. But the horse was not simply another animal. It was a form of technology, a living technology. It could carry a person. It could transport belongings. It could increase hunting range. It could help move camp. And eventually it could become part of warfare. The first communities to acquire horses had an enormous opportunity, but they also faced a challenge. A horse had to be understood, it had to be trained, it had to be fed, it had to be cared for, and a rider had to learn how to control an animal that could move much faster than a human being. This required knowledge. People experimented with different forms of riding equipment. They developed methods of training horses. They learned how to approach them, how to calm them, how to guide them, and how to make them useful in different situations. The process was passed from experienced riders to younger generations. A child who grew up around horses could begin learning at an early age. Over time, riding became more than a skill. It became part of culture. And as horses spread across the plains, their effects multiplied. A mounted hunter could travel farther than a hunter on foot. A family with horses could move camp more quickly. A horse could carry heavy loads. A rider could scout distant territory. And a community with large herds could accumulate wealth. The horse therefore changed the meaning of distance. Before the horse, a journey of many miles required considerable effort. With horses, that same distance could become much easier. A community could follow buffalo herds farther, trade networks could expand, information could travel faster, and relationships between distant peoples could become more frequent. But there was another consequence: competition. Horses became valuable, very valuable. A community with many horses had advantages over a community with few. Horse herds could be traded, they could be exchanged as gifts, they could become part of marriage arrangements, and they could be captured during the raids. This created a new economy. Across the plains, horses became connected to status, wealth, mobility, and power. Yet each nation adapted the horse differently. There was never one single plains horse culture. The Comanche became famous for their extraordinary horsemanship. The Lakota developed their own highly effective mounted traditions. The Cheyenne and Arapaho became skilled riders and hunters. The Kiowa developed powerful horse-centered traditions, and many other indigenous peoples incorporated horses into their lives in their own ways. The horse did not erase older cultures. Instead, people adapted the animal to existing traditions. That distinction is important. The plains peoples did not simply become horse warriors because horses appeared. They became horse warriors because they combined the new possibilities of the horse with knowledge they already possessed. They understood the land. They understood animals. They understood movement. They understood hunting. And they understood warfare. The horse simply expanded those abilities. Over the next several generations, something extraordinary would happen. The plains would become one of the greatest centers of mounted culture in North America. Some communities would develop enormous horse herds. Others would become famous for their ability to hunt buffalo from horseback. Some would become feared raiders. Others would use horses primarily for transportation and trade, and many would do all of these things. The result would be a transformation so profound that later observers sometimes struggled to imagine the plains without horses. But the horse age was still young. The greatest horse nations had not yet reached their height. The Comanche were beginning their remarkable expansion. The Lakota were moving toward a new era of power. The Cheyenne and Arapaho were adapting. The Kiowa were developing their own mounted traditions. And throughout the Great Plains, young riders were learning a new skill: how to become one with a horse. They would learn to ride across uneven ground, to turn quickly, to hunt at speed, to control an animal with subtle movements, and eventually so to fight from its back. The transformation had begun, and it would change North America forever. So as the wind moves gently across the imagined grasslands tonight, remember that the story we are beginning is not simply about horses. It is about human adaptation. It is about knowledge passed from one generation to another. It is about how a new technology can transform an entire society. And it is about the remarkable peoples who took an animal introduced from another continent and turned it into one of the foundations of their own world. The greatest horse warriors of the plains were still waiting in the future. Their story was only beginning. The horse had arrived in North America again. At first, it was still a relatively rare animal. A few horses could transform the life of a family, but a large herd required knowledge, grassland, water, and careful management. The Plains peoples had to learn all of this, and they learned quickly. Horses spread through trade, capture, gift exchange, migration, and contact between indigenous communities. A horse that began in one region could eventually travel hundreds of miles through a network of human relationships. This was one of the most important transformations in the history of the Great Plains. The horse did not spread through a single organized movement. There was no single nation that controlled its distribution. Instead, knowledge and animals moved from community to community. A horse might be traded for hides. Another might be given as a diplomatic gift. A third might be captured during a conflict. Some escaped and joined free-ranging herds, and gradually more communities gained access to horses. The process took generations. As horses became more common, indigenous people began experimenting with them. Which horses were strongest? Which were calm? Which could travel long distances? Which could carry heavy loads? Which could move quickly? Which were easier to train? These questions became increasingly important. Horse breeding and training became specialized knowledge. Experienced horsemen could recognize an animal's temperament almost immediately. They understood that not every horse was suitable for every task. A powerful horse might be useful for carrying heavy loads. A fast horse might be valuable for hunting. A calm horse might be ideal for children. Another might be especially responsive to subtle movements from a rider. This knowledge accumulated over generations, and children learned by watching adults. A young rider did not begin by charging across the plains. They learned balance first. They learned how to sit, how to guide, how to stop, how to remain calm when an animal suddenly moved. Then they gradually became more confident. Eventually, riding could become almost instinctive. The rider and horse seemed to move as one. This was especially important for hunting. The buffalo was not an easy animal to hunt from horseback. An adult buffalo could weigh well over 1,000 pounds. It could run surprisingly fast, and it could be dangerous when approached too closely. A hunter, therefore, needed more than courage. They needed timing. They needed to understand the horse. They needed to understand the buffalo, and they needed to understand the terrain. Mounted hunting allowed indigenous hunters to approach buffalo in ways that had previously been impossible. A rider could follow a moving herd. They could maneuver around individual animals. They could maintain a steady distance, and they could move quickly when the herd changed direction. The horse transformed the hunt from a carefully planned encounter into a highly mobile pursuit. But the greatest change was not simply speed, it was range. A mounted hunter could travel much farther in a single day. This meant that communities could search larger areas for buffalo. They could follow herds as they moved. They could relocate camps more efficiently, and they could maintain connections across greater distances. The plains themselves seemed to become smaller. A river that had once seemed far away was now within reach. A distant hunting ground became accessible. A neighboring community could be visited more easily. Trade expanded, communication expanded, and political relationships expanded. The horse was becoming part of a larger social transformation. This transformation was particularly dramatic among the Comanche. The Comanche had originally been associated with the eastern Shoshone world of the Rocky Mountain region. Over time, some Comanche groups moved onto the southern plains. There, the horse became central to their way of life. They discovered an environment perfectly suited to mounted mobility. The southern plains contained enormous grasslands. Buffalo were abundant, and the terrain allowed riders to travel enormous distances. The Comanche adapted to this environment with extraordinary speed. Their horse herds grew, their hunting techniques became increasingly sophisticated, and their mobility allowed them to expand their influence. But they were not alone. Farther north, other plains peoples were developing their own horse cultures. The Lakota were becoming increasingly skilled mounted hunters. The Cheyenne and Arapaho were adapting to life on the plains. The Kiowa were developing strong equestrian traditions. Crow, Blackfeet, Pawnee, and many other nations incorporated horses into their economies and societies in different ways. There was no single model. Each nation developed its own methods. Some emphasized hunting. Some emphasized trade. Some became especially known for raiding. Others used horses primarily for transportation. Many did all of these things, and as horses became more important, horse ownership became connected to social status. A person with a large herd possessed wealth, but wealth was not always measured simply by the number of animals. A respected horse could have a reputation. Certain horses were valued because of their speed, others because of their endurance, some because of their history. A horse could become part of a family's story. It could be remembered for the journeys it had made, the hunts it had survived, or the people it had carried. Horse culture therefore became deeply personal, but it also became political. Leaders who possessed large herds had resources that could support their communities. Horses could be traded for weapons, for clothing, for food, for manufactured goods. They could strengthen diplomatic relationships. A gift of horses could communicate respect, and a successful horse raid could dramatically increase a band's wealth. This was one reason conflict over horses became common across the plains. A horse was not simply an animal. It represented mobility, and mobility represented power. The ability to move quickly could mean the difference between finding buffalo and going hungry. It could mean escaping an enemy. It could mean reaching a trading partner, or it could mean traveling to a distant gathering. The horse expanded the geographical world of plains societies, but with greater mobility came greater responsibility. Large herds required grazing land. They required water, they required protection, and they had to be moved when conditions changed. This encouraged plains communities to develop detailed knowledge of landscapes. People learned where water could be found, where grass remained green, where winter conditions were less severe, and where horses could be safely kept. The environment became part of horse management. The best horsemen were therefore also students of the land. They understood weather, animal behavior, plants, rivers, and seasonal changes. Their success depended upon all of these things. As horse culture developed, another important tool became increasingly common: the travois. A simple frame could be attached to a horse and used to carry belongings. This made moving camp much easier. A family could transport more goods. Children could travel. Shelters could be moved. Food could be carried, and camps could relocate with greater speed. The horse had therefore transformed not only hunting and warfare, but everyday life. A community could become more mobile without sacrificing as much material comfort. The result was a new balance between movement and stability. People could travel with the seasons, they could follow buffalo, they could visit distant relatives, and they could gather for ceremonies and trade. The plains became increasingly interconnected. But the rise of horse culture also changed the balance of power between nations. A community with many horses could travel farther than one without them. It could hunt more efficiently. It could trade more widely. And it could potentially defend itself more effectively. This did not mean that horses automatically made one nation stronger than another. Skill mattered. Organization mattered. Knowledge mattered. The ability to care for animals mattered, and geography mattered. But horses created possibilities that had not existed before. Over time, those possibilities would be developed to an extraordinary degree. The Comanche would become legendary for their mounted skills. The Lakota would become famous for their horse culture. The Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Crow, and many others would develop their own remarkable traditions. And together these nations would create one of the most distinctive mounted cultures in world history. But there was still a long way to go. The horse had become common. Now people had to master it. They had to learn how to ride farther, hunt faster, move silently, control a horse with remarkable precision, and eventually fight from horseback. The next stage of the story would be about the riders themselves because a horse could provide speed. But it was the human being who turned that speed into skill. And across the Great Plains, generation after generation was learning how. The horse had become part of life on the Great Plains. But owning a horse and mastering a horse were two very different things. A rider had to learn balance, timing, patience, and trust. The greatest horsemen were not simply people who could stay on an animal while it ran. They understood the horse so well that even the smallest movement could communicate an instruction. A shift of weight, a movement of the legs, a change in posture, a light touch of the reins. The horse responded. This kind of skill took years to develop, and on the plains, children often began learning at an early age. A child might first sit on a quiet horse while an older family member held the animal. Later, the child would learn to guide it, then to ride independently. Eventually, they would learn to move at greater speed. The process was gradual. There was no need to rush. A horse could be powerful and unpredictable. A frightened animal could throw a rider. A poorly trained horse could become dangerous. So experienced horsemen paid close attention to temperament. They learned that every horse was different. Some were nervous, some were stubborn, some were calm, some were naturally fast. Others had extraordinary endurance. The best riders learned to work with those differences rather than against them. This understanding became one of the foundations of plains horsemanship. The rider did not simply command the horse. The rider developed a relationship with it. That relationship mattered greatly during the buffalo hunt. A buffalo herd could move suddenly. One moment, the animals might be calm. The next, the entire herd could begin running. A rider needed to remain balanced while moving at speed. They needed to guide the horse around other animals. They needed to avoid collisions, and they needed to position themselves close enough to hunt without becoming dangerously close. This required extraordinary coordination. The rider had to think about the buffalo, the horse, the terrain, the wind, and the other hunters, all at the same time. Mounted hunting therefore became a skill that combined athletic ability with deep environmental knowledge. The rider needed to understand how buffalo behaved. A buffalo did not simply run in a straight line. Herds could change direction. Individual animals could separate. Young animals could move toward the center. Older animals might behave differently. An experienced hunter learned these patterns, and the horse learned them too. This created a remarkable partnership. The rider watched the herd. The horse responded. Together, they moved. This was one reason Plains horse culture became so sophisticated. It was not based only on strength, it was based on communication. The same principle applied to travel. A skilled rider could travel for long periods without exhausting the horse. They knew when to move quickly, when to slow down, when to rest, and where to find water. This was particularly important on the southern plains and in the drier regions farther west. Water could determine the success of an entire journey. A rider who knew where a spring or river could be found possessed valuable knowledge. The horse depended upon that knowledge. The rider depended upon the horse. Again, the relationship was mutual. As horse culture developed, indigenous peoples also developed specialized equipment. Saddles were adapted to local needs, bridles and reins were made from available materials. Blankets and other padding helped protect the horse and rider, and simple tools could be repaired or replaced while traveling. The Plains peoples became skilled at maintaining their equipment. A broken strap could not simply be ignored. A damaged piece of tack could become dangerous. So riders learned practical skills. They understood leather, rope, wood, animal materials, and the construction of their equipment. The horse culture of the Plains was therefore supported by an entire network of knowledge. Riding was only one part, training was another, breeding was another, feeding was another, equipment was another, and understanding the environment was another. Together, these skills created something much larger, a complete equestrian culture. The Comanche became particularly famous for their abilities. Their movement onto the southern plains placed them in a landscape ideal for mounted life. They became highly mobile. They developed large horse herds, and they used horses for hunting, trade, travel, and warfare. Their skill became so impressive that later observers often described Comanche riders with a mixture of admiration and fear. But the Comanche were not alone. The Lakota developed their own sophisticated mounted traditions. The Cheyenne became skilled horsemen. The Arapaho became accomplished mounted hunters. The Kiowa developed strong equestrian traditions. The Crow were renowned for their horsemanship, and many other Plains nations developed specialized techniques. This was not a single culture. It was a collection of related horse cultures. Each community learned from its own experiences, and communities also learned from one another. Trade and warfare allowed knowledge to spread. A riding technique seen in one region might eventually appear somewhere else. A particular type of horse might become desirable. A new piece of equipment could be copied. A successful hunting technique could be observed and adapted. The Plains were therefore an enormous laboratory of equestrian knowledge. People experimented constantly, and the environment rewarded those who learned quickly. But horses were not only tools for survival, they became symbols of status. A person with an impressive horse herd could gain respect. A warrior with a particularly fast horse could become known for it. A successful hunter could develop a reputation, and leaders could use horses as gifts to strengthen relationships. Horse ownership became connected to generosity. A wealthy person could give horses to relatives, to friends, to allies, or to people in need. This helped strengthen social relationships. The horse was therefore part of an economic system, but also part of a social system. And as communities accumulated horses, they needed ways to protect them. Horse stealing became an important part of Plains conflict. A successful raid could bring valuable animals into a community. But stealing horses could also create revenge. One raid could lead to another. A stolen horse could become the reason for a conflict that lasted for years. This contributed to the rise of mounted raiding traditions. Young warriors could demonstrate courage and skill by approaching an enemy camp and taking horses. Such actions required extraordinary nerve. The rider had to enter a dangerous situation. They had to control the horse, they had to avoid detection, and they had to escape quickly. Success could bring prestige, but failure could be deadly. This was one reason mounted warfare on the plains developed such a distinctive character. It emphasized speed, surprise, mobility, and individual skill. A warrior did not necessarily need to destroy an enemy army. A small group could achieve its objective and disappear. The horse made this possible. A rider could approach from a distance, attack, turn, and escape. The open plains offered enormous space for movement. A pursuing force might see the riders disappear over a ridge away and never catch them. This was one of the reasons European and American soldiers often struggled to understand plains warfare. They were accustomed to organized armies, fixed positions, marching formations, and conventional battlefields. Plains warfare was different. It could be fluid, decentralized, and highly mobile. A battle might last only minutes. A raid could involve only a handful of riders, and an entire campaign could unfold across hundreds of miles. The horse made this possible, but the horse itself was not the source of all this skill. The people who rode them were. They had developed a culture in which horsemanship was taught from childhood, a culture in which horses were valued, a culture in which the landscape was understood in extraordinary detail, and a culture in which mobility could determine survival. By now, the horse was no longer an outside influence. It had become part of plains identity, and the next step would take that identity even further. The horse would become not only a hunting partner, but a weapon of war. The greatest mounted warriors would learn to shoot while riding, to maneuver at speed, to attack from unexpected directions, and to use the horse as both transportation and protection. But before warfare transformed the plains, there was another relationship that needed to be understood. The relationship between the horse, the buffalo, and the enormous wealth created by the plains economy. Because without the buffalo, there would have been far fewer reasons to become such extraordinary riders in the first place. And that is where our journey will continue. The horse had transformed the way people moved across the Great Plains. But its greatest impact could only be understood by looking at the animal that had shaped plains life long before the horse arrived, the buffalo. For countless generations, buffalo had provided the foundation of life for many plains communities. They provided food, they provided hides, they provided materials for clothing and shelter, they provided bones for tools, and they provided the resources that allowed communities to travel with the seasons. When horses became part of this world, the relationship between people, horses, and buffalo created something extraordinary. The hunt became faster, the hunting range became larger, and the ability to follow enormous herds across the plains became one of the greatest advantages a mounted hunter could possess. Imagine the Great Plains before the modern world. There are no fences stretching toward the horizon, no paved roads, no distant city lights, only grassland, wind, rivers, and immense herds of buffalo moving across the landscape. For a hunter on foot, approaching those animals required careful planning. For a mounted hunter, an entirely new world opened. A horse could carry a hunter directly toward a moving herd. It could maintain speed alongside the animals, and it could allow the rider to reposition quickly when the herd changed direction. But this did not make hunting easy. A buffalo was still an enormous and powerful animal. A frightened herd could become dangerous. A horse could become frightened as well. So the hunter needed extraordinary control. The best riders learned to remain calm. They learned to read their horse's movements, and they learned to recognize the behavior of the buffalo. This was where generations of knowledge became important. A young hunter could watch an experienced relative. They could observe how the horse was handled, how the rider approached the herd, how the animal was selected, and how the hunt was conducted. Then slowly the younger hunter learned to do the same. Knowledge became tradition. Tradition became expertise. And expertise became one of the defining characteristics of Plains horse culture. The Comanche became especially famous for this. Living across the southern plains, they had access to enormous buffalo populations and extensive grasslands. Their mobility allowed them to follow herds across huge territories. Their horses allowed them to transport meat and hides. And their growing herds of horses provided the mobility necessary to maintain this way of life. But the Comanche were not alone. The Kiowa, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Lakota, Crow, Blackfeet, Pawnee, and many other peoples also developed sophisticated relationships with horses and buffalo. Each had its own traditions. Each adapted the horse to its own environment, and each developed distinctive methods of hunting. The plains were therefore becoming a world of specialized horse cultures. Some communities became famous for the size of their horse herds. Others developed exceptional hunting traditions. Others became particularly skilled at mounted warfare, and many combined all three. The horse also changed the economics of buffalo hunting. A successful hunt could produce enormous quantities of food, but it could also produce valuable hides. Those hides could be turned into robes, clothing, coverings, and trade goods. The horse made it easier to transport these products. A family with horses could move more belongings. A hunting party could carry more meat, and a community could transport hides over much greater distances. Trade networks expanded. Buffalo products could move between communities. Horses could move in the opposite direction. European manufactured goods could enter indigenous economies. Metal tools became increasingly common. Firearms became valuable. Cloth and other materials entered the plains economy. The result was a complex system in which traditional resources and newly introduced goods existed together. The horse was at the center of this system. A successful horse owner possessed more than transportation. They possessed economic power. A horse could be exchanged for valuable goods. It could be given as a diplomatic gift. It could strengthen a marriage alliance, or it could be added to a growing herd. Over time, large horse herds became symbols of wealth. But wealth on the plains did not necessarily mean keeping everything for yourself. Generosity could create status. A respected person might give horses to relatives. They might provide animals to people who had suffered losses. They might exchange horses during ceremonies. They might offer horses as gifts to strengthen political relationships. In this way, horses helped create social networks. The animals moved between families and communities, and with them moved wealth, information, and relationships. But horses also created new forms of competition. A community with many horses could travel farther. It could transport more goods. It could hunt more efficiently. And it could potentially conduct raids against communities with fewer horses. Horse raiding became an important part of plains warfare and diplomacy. A successful horse raid could increase the wealth of a young warrior, but it could also create enemies. If one group lost horses, they might attempt to recover them. That could lead to another raid, and another. The cycle could continue. This helped create the highly mobile warfare for which plains peoples later became famous. But it is important to understand that horse raiding was not simply random theft. It existed within a broader cultural world involving status, courage, wealth, revenge, and competition. A young warrior could gain prestige through a successful raid, yet courage could also be demonstrated in other ways: protecting the community, rescuing someone, showing generosity, or performing a difficult act during warfare. The horse simply expanded the possibilities. And as horse culture developed, young people learned that horsemanship was connected to adulthood. A skilled rider could earn respect. A skilled hunter could provide for a family. A successful horsekeeper could build wealth. A capable warrior could protect others. The horse, therefore, became intertwined with identity. It was no longer simply an animal introduced from Europe. It had become part of the social fabric of the plains. This transformation was especially dramatic among the Comanche. Their expansion across the southern plains was closely connected to their ability to move quickly and exploit the horse. They became powerful traders, hunters, raiders, and diplomats. Their influence eventually reached enormous distances. They could interact with Spanish settlements in New Mexico, trade with Pueblo communities, raid into northern Mexico, and compete with other plains peoples. Their horses made these connections possible, but the Lakota were also developing a powerful horse culture farther north. As they expanded onto the plains, horses helped transform their hunting economy. The horse allowed them to follow buffalo herds across wider territories. It helped transport camps, and it provided new opportunities for warfare. The Cheyenne and Arapaho experienced similar transformations. So did the Kiowa and the Crow and many others. The plains were becoming increasingly connected through horses, yet there was something deeper happening. The horse was changing people's relationship with distance. A place that once required days of walking could now be reached much faster. A hunting ground could be revisited more frequently. A distant relative could be visited. A trade partner could be reached. A warning could travel. And a warrior could move rapidly across territory. This mobility created political power. A nation capable of moving quickly could respond to threats. It could shift its camps. It could follow resources. And it could maintain connections across vast areas. The horse had therefore become more than a tool. It had become a force reshaping geography. The plains were still enormous, but for those who mastered horses, they became more accessible. This was the beginning of the great horse warrior era. The riders of the plains were becoming faster, more confident, and more skilled. They were learning to hunt at speed, to travel long distances, to manage large herds, and to use horses in conflict. But the next transformation would be even more dramatic. The horse would become part of a new style of warfare, a style based not on standing in line, but on movement, surprise, speed, and individual skill. The mounted warrior was emerging, and among the Comanche, Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, and other plains peoples, that warrior would become one of the most formidable figures on the North American continent. The mounted warrior was becoming one of the defining figures of the Great Plains, but becoming an exceptional horse warrior required much more than owning a fast horse. It required years of training, it required knowledge of the land, and it required a deep understanding of movement. A warrior on horseback had to control two bodies at once, his own and the horse beneath him. The greatest riders could turn quickly without losing balance. They could accelerate when necessary. They could slow down without making the horse panic. And they could guide the animal while concentrating on everything happening around them. This skill was developed gradually. Young people watched experienced riders. They learned how horses behaved. They learned how to approach them. They learned how to recognize fear, exhaustion, excitement, and aggression. and eventually they learned how to make the horse respond almost instinctively. Among many Plains peoples, horsemanship became part of everyday life. Children grew up around horses. They watched adults train them, they learned to care for them, they learned how to feed them, they learned how to recognize a good horse. And they learned that the relationship between rider and animal could determine success or failure. A poorly trained horse could become a danger. A frightened horse could ruin a hunt. A tired horse could leave a rider stranded far from home. But a well-trained horse could carry its rider across enormous distances. It could travel through rough country. It could remain calm during chaos. And it could respond to subtle movements. This was especially important during warfare. The Plains warrior did not usually fight like a soldier, standing in a rigid formation. Instead, mobility was the great advantage. A small group of riders could travel quickly. They could approach an enemy. They could change direction. They could withdraw. And they could return from another direction. This required an entirely different understanding of combat. Speed was important. But speed alone was not enough. A fast rider who could not control his horse was vulnerable. A rider who understood timing could be far more effective. The horse became an extension of the warrior. This was particularly evident in mounted archery. The bow had already been an important weapon among many indigenous peoples, but the horse gave the bow new possibilities. A mounted archer could move while shooting. He could approach an opponent, release an arrow, change direction, and create distance again. The rider did not need to remain in one position. The entire battlefield could become a moving space. This style of warfare was difficult for conventional armies to counter. Soldiers, trained to fight from fixed positions, could struggle against opponents who constantly changed distance and direction. The Plains warrior could appear on the horizon, then disappear. He could move around an enemy formation. He could attack from the side. He could retreat. And if the enemy pursued, the riders could turn the pursuit into another opportunity. This did not mean Plains warriors were invincible. They could be defeated. They could suffer serious losses, and different communities experienced warfare differently, but their mobility gave them enormous advantages in the environments they knew best. Among the Comanche, mounted warfare became especially sophisticated. Their ability to travel across the southern plains allowed them to conduct raids over enormous distances. A Comanche group could travel deep into territory controlled by another community. They could take horses. They could gather information. They could strike quickly, and they could return before a larger force had time to respond. The horse made these operations possible, but the skill of the rider made them effective. The same was true among the Lakota. As Lakota communities expanded their presence across the plains, horses became increasingly important. Mounted hunting supported larger communities. Mounted travel connected distant bands, and mounted warfare became part of a broader warrior tradition. The Cheyenne and Arapaho also developed strong mounted traditions. So did the Kiowa. So did the Crow. The plains were not dominated by a single horse nation. Instead, many peoples became exceptional riders. They learned from experience, they observed one another, they competed, they traded, and sometimes they fought. This constant interaction encouraged innovation. A technique that worked could spread. A horse breed that proved useful could become desirable. A piece of equipment could be copied, and a successful tactic could be remembered and taught to younger generations. The horse culture of the plains was therefore constantly evolving. One of the most remarkable developments was the ability to remain extremely mobile while carrying weapons and supplies. A rider could carry a bow, arrows, a knife, other equipment, and sometimes firearms as those became more available. The horse allowed warriors to move with their equipment without becoming exhausted on foot. This created a level of operational mobility that surprised many European and American observers. But there was another advantage: communication. A rider could carry information across enormous distances. If a neighboring community needed assistance, a messenger could travel quickly. If buffalo were found in large numbers, news could spread. If enemies were approaching, riders could warn others. The horse became part of an information network. The plains were enormous, but mounted messengers could connect communities across that distance. This helped strengthen political relationships. It also helped coordinate large gatherings, ceremonies, trade, and military responses. The horse was therefore involved in almost every aspect of plains life. It carried hunters, it carried children, it carried elders, it transported possessions, it carried messages, and it carried warriors. The animal had become essential, but there was a limit. A horse could not run forever. It needed water, it needed food, it needed rest, and it could become injured. The best horse warriors understood these limitations. They knew when to push an animal and when to stop. They learned that preserving a horse could be more important than winning a single encounter. A good horse might be worth more than a moment of glory. This practical understanding helped sustain large horse cultures. Communities developed ways of managing herds. Horses could graze freely in suitable areas. They could be gathered when necessary. Certain animals could be reserved for specific tasks. The best horses could be protected and bred. Over generations, communities developed knowledge of bloodlines and characteristics. This was another reason horses became wealth. A strong herd could produce more valuable horses, and valuable horses could be traded. The horse economy became increasingly complex. Horses could move between communities through trade. They could be exchanged during diplomatic meetings. They could be given as gifts. They could also be taken during raids. This last practice became particularly important. Horse raids were not simply about obtaining transportation. They could be a test of courage. A successful rider who entered an enemy camp and escaped with horses could gain prestige. The risk was enormous. The horses would be guarded. The camp might contain warriors, and an alarm could be raised at any moment. The rider therefore needed stealth, patience, speed, and control. The horse had to remain quiet. The rider had to remain calm. And once the horses were taken, the escape had to be fast. These raids became part of a larger culture of warrior achievement. But it is important to remember that plains warfare was not constant. Communities also traded. They visited one another. They formed alliances. They married. They exchanged information. They shared ceremonies and ideas. The same horse that carried a warrior into conflict could carry a trader into another community. The same animal that could be captured during a raid could later become part of a trade agreement. The plains were therefore not simply a battlefield. They were a network of relationships, and horses strengthened those relationships. By the 18th and 19th centuries, some plains communities possessed enormous herds. These herds represented wealth and independence. They allowed people to travel, they supported hunting, and they made mounted warfare possible. This created a remarkable civilization built around mobility. Yet the horse itself was only one part of the equation. The real achievement belonged to the people who learned how to use it. They transformed an animal introduced by Europeans into something deeply connected to their own cultures. They developed techniques that outsiders struggled to understand. They turned open grasslands into a world where speed and mobility could overcome numerical disadvantages. And they created a tradition of horsemanship that would become legendary. The next step in that transformation would come from the hunt. because the same skills that made a warrior dangerous in combat made a mounted hunter extraordinarily effective against the buffalo. And the buffalo hunt would become one of the greatest demonstrations of plains horsemanship. Across the grasslands, riders were preparing, horses were being selected, bows were being checked, families were watching the herd, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the buffalo were moving. The buffalo hunt was where the remarkable relationship between horse and rider truly became visible. Across the Great Plains, enormous herds moved with the seasons. For generations, indigenous hunters had followed those herds on foot. But the horse changed everything. Now a hunter could travel farther. He could follow a herd for longer. He could maneuver around individual animals, and he could return to camp carrying far more than a person traveling on foot could comfortably manage. Yet mounted buffalo hunting was not simply a matter of riding quickly toward the animals. It required extraordinary skill. A horse had to remain calm around a massive herd. The rider had to maintain balance while moving at speed. And the hunter had to understand exactly how buffalo behaved. A buffalo herd could appear peaceful one moment and then suddenly begin moving. Thousands of animals could surge forward together. The ground could tremble beneath their hooves. Dust could rise into the air. For an inexperienced rider, the scene could be overwhelming. For a skilled plains hunter, it was a familiar world. The hunter watched the animals carefully. He looked for changes in direction. He noticed the position of individual buffalo. He understood how the herd reacted when approached, and his horse responded to subtle movements. The greatest riders seemed almost effortless. They did not need dramatic gestures. A slight shift in weight could guide the horse. A small movement of the legs could change direction. The reins could communicate speed and control. Horse and rider became a single moving unit. This partnership was especially important because the buffalo was powerful. A mature bull could weigh more than 1,000 pounds. Its horns could be dangerous. Its strength was enormous. A horse that became frightened could create a dangerous situation. So hunters selected horses carefully. Some horses were naturally calmer around buffalo. Others were particularly agile. Some had excellent endurance. The best hunting horses became extremely valuable. A family might remember a horse for generations. A famous hunting horse could become part of a family's stories. The skills of the rider mattered just as much. A hunter needed to know when to approach, when to slow down, and when to move away. The objective was not simply speed, it was control. A rider who moved too quickly could frighten the animals. A rider who moved too slowly might lose the opportunity. The successful hunter found the right balance. This required years of experience. Children could begin learning the basics of riding at a young age. As they grew older, they could observe experienced hunters. They learned how to handle horses, how to read tracks, how to recognize buffalo behavior, and how to move across the landscape without wasting energy. By adulthood, a skilled hunter could understand the plains almost intuitively. He knew where buffalo were likely to be found. He understood the condition of the grass. He recognized the signs of approaching weather, and he knew where water was available. This knowledge made mounted hunting much more than a physical activity. It was environmental knowledge combined with horsemanship. The same principle applied to the movement of entire communities. When buffalo herds moved, people could move with them. Horses made this possible on a much larger scale. A family could pack its belongings onto horses and travois. Children could travel without walking long distances. Heavy materials could be transported, and camps could be relocated more quickly. This mobility was one of the foundations of plains life. It allowed communities to follow resources without abandoning the ability to carry substantial possessions. The horse, therefore, helped create a distinctive balance. People could remain mobile, but they did not have to travel lightly. They could carry shelters, tools, food, clothing, and other necessities. This made seasonal movement much more practical. Among the Comanche, mobility became especially important. Their homeland across the southern plains offered enormous grasslands and abundant buffalo. Their horses allowed them to move rapidly through this environment. They could hunt across huge territories. They could trade with distant communities, and they could maintain connections over great distances. The Comanche became one of the most powerful horse cultures in North America. But farther north, other nations were developing equally impressive traditions. The Lakota became increasingly dependent on horses for buffalo hunting and transportation. The Cheyenne and Arapaho developed their own mounted hunting techniques. The Kiowa became famous for their horsemanship. The Crow were renowned for their horses and mounted skills. And many other Plains nations became accomplished riders. There was competition between them, but there was also exchange. Trade routes carried horses between communities. Individuals sometimes moved between groups. Captives could be adopted. Families formed relationships across political boundaries. And knowledge traveled with people. This meant that Plains horse culture was constantly evolving. One community might develop a particularly effective method. Another might adapt it. A new type of horse could appear. A new piece of equipment could be adopted. And a generation later, the entire landscape could look different. The horse also transformed trade. Before horses became widespread, moving large quantities of goods across the plains was difficult. Human beings could carry only so much. Dogs pulling travois had been useful, but horses could carry far more. A trader could travel greater distances. He could carry hides, meat, tools, clothing, and other valuable goods. This encouraged long-distance exchange. Horses themselves became major trade items. A person who possessed a large herd could trade animals for goods from distant communities. Spanish and later Mexican settlements became sources of manufactured products, metal objects, firearms, cloth, and other materials entered indigenous economies. The plains were becoming part of a much larger economic network, but the horse also changed warfare. The same mobility that helped a hunter follow buffalo could help a warrior cross enemy territory. The same speed that allowed a trader to reach another community could allow a raiding party to approach unexpectedly. And the same understanding of terrain that helped a hunter could help a warrior escape. This was one reason the horse became so important to Plains societies. It connected every major part of life: hunting, travel, trade, warfare, communication, and wealth. But horses also created responsibilities. A large herd needed care. Animals needed access to grass and water. They needed protection from theft. And they needed to be moved when conditions changed. Horse management became a specialized skill. People learned which animals were suitable for breeding, which were best for hunting, which were best for carrying loads, and which were best for long-distance travel. Over time, some families became especially respected for their horses. A large herd could provide economic security, but generosity remained important. Horses could be given to relatives, they could be offered as gifts, they could be exchanged during important social events, and they could help strengthen alliances. This meant that horses were not simply private property in the modern sense. They existed within networks of social obligations. A person's wealth could be measured partly by the animals they possessed, but their reputation could also depend on how they used that wealth. A generous horse owner could gain respect. A successful hunter could provide for others. A skilled warrior could protect the community. The horse, therefore, became connected to ideas of responsibility and status. And gradually, the mounted warrior became one of the most important figures on the plains. But the warrior was not simply a fighter. He was a hunter, a traveler, a messenger, a protector, and sometimes a trader. His horse allowed him to perform all of these roles. This versatility explains why horse culture spread so deeply. The animal was useful everywhere. It could carry a hunter after buffalo. It could carry a messenger across hundreds of miles. It could pull a travois. It could carry a warrior. And it could become a treasured part of a family herd. By the middle of the 19th century, outsiders looking across the plains sometimes saw a landscape filled with mounted people, but they were seeing the result of generations of adaptation. The horse had not created plains society. The plains peoples had created new possibilities from the horse. They combined an introduced animal with ancient knowledge of the land. They developed new hunting techniques, new economic systems, new forms of mobility, and new forms of warfare. The result was one of the most remarkable equestrian cultures in North American history. And yet, the most famous part of that story was still ahead, because the plains warrior would take everything he had learned, balance, speed, horsemanship, knowledge of terrain, and control, and apply it to warfare on an extraordinary scale. The open plains were about to become a battlefield, unlike almost anywhere else in North America, and the riders who knew those grasslands best would prove extraordinarily difficult to defeat. The plains warrior was entering a new age. By now, horses were no longer simply useful animals. They had become part of the social, economic, and military world of many plains nations. Young riders were learning to control horses at remarkable speeds. Hunters were following buffalo across enormous distances. Messengers were traveling between distant communities. And warriors were discovering that a horse could transform the way a person fought. But mounted warfare on the plains was not simply about charging toward an enemy. It was about movement. The open grasslands offered few permanent barriers. There were no walls surrounding most camps, no narrow streets, no fortified castles. Instead, there was space, and space favored the rider who knew how to use it. A mounted warrior could approach from a distance. He could circle. He could retreat. He could change direction. And he could disappear beyond the horizon. This required extraordinary control. A rider had to trust the horse. The horse had to remain responsive. And both had to remain calm under pressure. One of the greatest advantages of mounted warfare was surprise. A small group could travel quietly across the landscape. They could approach an enemy camp before anyone realized they were nearby. Then, if necessary, they could move away rapidly. This was very different from the style of warfare practiced by large European armies. European military traditions often emphasized formations, discipline, fixed positions, and coordinated volleys. Plains warfare could be much more fluid. It could involve small groups, individual decisions, rapid movement, and sudden changes of direction. That did not make plains warfare disorganized. Quite the opposite. It required a different kind of discipline. Every rider needed to understand the movements of the others. A warrior needed to know when to advance, when to withdraw, when to separate, and when to regroup. Communication could happen through gestures, calls, or simple changes in direction. Experienced riders could understand one another without lengthy instructions. This was especially useful when speed mattered. The Comanche became famous for this kind of mobility. Their horse culture allowed them to operate across enormous portions of the southern plains. They could travel far from their home territory. They could hunt, trade, scout, and raid. Their mobility became so important that some historians have described the Comanche world as a powerful mounted society rather than simply a collection of warriors. The horse supported everything. A family could move with its belongings. Hunters could reach distant buffalo herds. Traders could travel to New Mexico. Warriors could cross large territories. And information could spread quickly. But the Comanche were not the only masters of mounted warfare. The Lakota developed powerful horse traditions as they expanded across the northern plains. The Cheyenne became highly skilled mounted warriors. The Arapaho developed similar traditions. The Kiowa became renowned for their horses and mounted fighting. The Crow were famous for their horsemanship, and many other plains peoples became exceptional riders. Each nation had its own customs, its own political organization, its own warrior traditions, and its own methods of using horses. This is important because the history of plains horse warriors was never the story of a single people. It was a much broader transformation. Many indigenous nations adapted the horse to their own needs, and they learned from the changing world around them. Mounted warfare also changed the meaning of distance. An enemy camp that had once been several days away on foot could now be reached much faster. A warning could travel quickly. A group could move away from danger. A hunting party could cross enormous areas. The horse made the plains more connected, but it also made conflict more mobile. A raid could cover great distances. A small group could enter enemy territory, and a successful group could return before a larger force had time to respond. This helped create a style of warfare based on speed and initiative. Yet warfare was only one part of plains society. The same riders who participated in conflict also participated in diplomacy. A mounted messenger could carry news between communities. A trader could travel with horses and goods. A leader could arrive at a meeting with an impressive horse herd. A gift of horses could help establish trust. This meant that horses could carry both conflict and peace. The same animal could be used to raid an enemy one year and exchanged in a peaceful trade the next. The plains were filled with changing relationships. Enemies could become temporary allies. Trade could continue between groups that sometimes fought. Families could develop connections across political boundaries, and horses moved through all of these relationships. As horse herds grew, the importance of horse theft also increased. A successful horse raid could dramatically increase a young warrior's wealth and reputation. But it was dangerous. The horses were usually guarded. An approaching rider could be discovered. An alarm could spread quickly. And once the horses were taken, the raiders had to escape. The skill required was enormous. A rider needed to approach quietly. They needed to control the animals. They needed to keep them from scattering. And then they needed to move quickly across unfamiliar territory. The horse itself could determine success. A fast, responsive animal could carry a rider away from danger. A nervous or exhausted horse could turn an escape into disaster. This is why experienced horsemen valued certain animals so highly. A particularly good horse could become famous within a community. It might be remembered for its speed, its endurance, its courage, or its ability to remain calm under pressure. Horses were also connected to warrior reputation. A successful rider could become known for his horsemanship. But plains warrior traditions were generally more complicated than simply counting enemies. Courage could be demonstrated in many ways: protecting others, rescuing someone, taking risks, showing leadership, or accomplishing difficult tasks. Mounted warfare created opportunities for all of these forms of achievement, and the horse amplified them. The rider could travel farther, take greater risks, and respond more quickly. But the relationship between horse and rider remained central. A warrior who mistreated a horse could lose its trust. A horse that trusted its rider could remain remarkably calm in dangerous situations. This partnership was one of the greatest strengths of Plains horsemanship. It was also one reason outsiders sometimes misunderstood what they were seeing. To a soldier arriving from the east, a Plains rider could appear almost impossibly skilled. The rider could turn sharply, lean low, move quickly, and maintain control. But this was not magic. It was training. It was repetition. It was knowledge passed from older riders to younger ones. And it was the result of growing up in a culture where horses mattered. A Plains child who spent years around horses had an advantage that an inexperienced soldier could not easily reproduce. The soldier might have a well-trained military horse, but the indigenous rider understood the landscape. He knew the trails. He knew the water sources. He knew how to travel without exhausting the animal. And he knew how to disappear into terrain that seemed open and empty to an outsider. The plains themselves became part of the weapon. A ridge could hide a group. A river could conceal tracks. Tall grass could provide temporary cover. A distant storm could obscure movement, and enormous distances could make pursuit difficult. The rider was therefore fighting with more than a horse. He was using the entire landscape. This was one reason American military campaigns against Plains peoples could become so difficult. Soldiers might win individual encounters, yet still struggle to control the territory. They could occupy a location, but riders could move around them. They could establish a fort, but the surrounding country remained enormous. They could pursue a group, but the group could travel farther than expected. The horse had transformed indigenous mobility, and now that mobility was becoming a form of military power, the greatest mounted warriors were not simply fast, they were patient, they were observant, they knew when to move, and they knew when not to move. Their strength came from understanding the relationship between rider, horse, terrain, and time. By the 19th century, these skills had reached an extraordinary level. The Plains had produced generations of horsemen capable of crossing enormous distances and operating in environments unfamiliar to outsiders. But another major development was changing warfare. Firearms were becoming increasingly common. Guns would eventually alter the balance between indigenous warriors and expanding American armies. Yet before that transformation was complete, the Plains horse warrior had reached the height of his power. The open grasslands were his world, the horse was his partner, and mobility was his greatest advantage. Soon, however, the forces of the outside world would begin closing in. Railroads, settlements, military forts, and the destruction of the buffalo. The horse warriors would continue to resist, but the world that had created them was already beginning to disappear. The great horse cultures of the Plains had reached a remarkable level of skill, but there was another reason their mounted warriors became so effective. They understood that warfare was not simply about weapons. It was about movement, information, timing, terrain, and the ability to choose when to fight. A warrior who could control the battlefield could sometimes defeat a larger force without ever standing still. This principle became especially important as the 19th century progressed. American soldiers were moving farther west, settlements were multiplying, and indigenous nations were increasingly forced to defend territories that were becoming smaller every year. For the Plains horse warrior, mobility became a form of survival. A mounted group could travel quickly when danger approached. They could scatter when necessary. They could regroup somewhere else. And they could use familiar terrain to their advantage. The horse made all of this possible. But the greatest advantage was not simply speed. It was flexibility. A rider could move across open ground in a way that a person on foot could not. He could approach from one direction and retreat in another. He could travel around obstacles. He could cross large distances between water sources, and he could carry weapons and supplies without becoming exhausted. This created a style of warfare that was difficult for conventional armies to understand. A European-style army often depended upon concentrated forces. Plains warriors could operate in smaller groups. They did not always need to remain together. They could separate across the landscape and communicate later. This made them difficult to locate. It also made them difficult to defeat in a single battle. The Comanche became particularly famous for this approach. Their power across the southern plains depended upon mobility. A Comanche group could travel enormous distances. They knew where water was available. They knew where buffalo could be found. They knew the trails through the grasslands, and they understood how to use the landscape to their advantage. The horse was the foundation of this mobility, but it was not the only foundation. The Comanche also possessed extensive knowledge of trade. They understood the markets of northern Mexico. They interacted with Pueblo communities. They traded horses and buffalo products. They acquired manufactured goods, and they maintained relationships with distant peoples. Their mounted power therefore existed within a larger economic system. The same horse that carried a warrior into battle could later carry a trader to a distant settlement. The same rider who understood how to approach an enemy could also understand how to approach a trading partner. This mixture of commerce and warfare was common across the plains. The Lakota developed their own powerful mounted culture farther north. As they expanded across the plains, horses became central to buffalo hunting. Mounted hunters could follow herds. Families could move camps. Warriors could travel rapidly, and leaders could maintain connections across enormous territories. The Cheyenne and Arapaho developed similar skills. So did the Kiowa, the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Pawnee, and many other plains nations. Each developed its own traditions, but all were adapting to the same fundamental change. The horse had made distance smaller, and when distance became smaller, opportunities multiplied. Trade became easier. Hunting became more efficient. Travel became faster. But conflict also became more intense. Horse raiding was one example. A warrior who successfully captured horses could gain wealth and reputation, but the raid could provoke retaliation. An enemy might respond by stealing horses from another camp. That could lead to another raid, and another. These cycles could continue for generations. Yet warfare was not constant. There were periods of peace. Treaties were negotiated. Trade continued. People gathered for ceremonies. Families formed relationships. And horses moved between communities through peaceful exchange. This is an important part of Plains history. The horse did not simply create a world of war, it created a world of connection. A person could travel farther, meet more people, exchange more goods, and learn from distant communities. The plains became increasingly interconnected, but as horses became more valuable, protecting them became essential. Large herds could represent enormous wealth. They required careful management. Families needed to know where animals were grazing. They needed to protect them from theft. And they needed to preserve the strongest horses for breeding and important tasks. Some horses became especially famous. A particular horse might be remembered for its speed, another for its endurance, another for its calm nature, and another for its ability to remain steady during a buffalo hunt. The relationship between people and horses could therefore become deeply personal. The horse was a source of wealth, but also a companion. A trusted animal could save a rider's life. A rider could also protect and care for the horse. This mutual dependence was one of the defining features of Plains horse culture. It also explains why skilled riders seemed so extraordinary to outsiders. The rider was not simply sitting on the horse, he was communicating with it. He could feel its movements, he could anticipate its reactions, and the horse could respond almost immediately. Years of practice created an almost instinctive relationship. A young rider might spend countless hours simply learning how to move comfortably with the horse. Later, more difficult skills could be introduced. Fast turns, sudden stops, long-distance riding, mounted hunting, and eventually, mounted combat. The bow was especially effective when combined with mobility. A rider could carry a bow and arrows while traveling. He could move into range, shoot, then create distance again. The enemy could not easily predict where the next attack would come from. This style of mounted archery had ancient parallels elsewhere in the world, but on the North American plains, indigenous peoples adapted it to their own landscape and circumstances. The result was distinctive. The rider could use the horse as both transportation and protection. The animal provided speed. The open terrain provided space, and the rider provided the skill. Firearms gradually became more common as well. Trade with Europeans, Mexicans, and Americans introduced muskets, rifles, pistols, and ammunition into indigenous economies. Different nations adopted firearms at different rates. Some continued relying heavily on bows, others combined firearms and traditional weapons. Eventually, firearms became increasingly important, but a gun did not automatically make someone a skilled mounted warrior. The rider still needed mobility. He still needed knowledge of the landscape, and he still needed control over the horse. The Plains warrior could therefore combine old and new technologies. A bow could be carried alongside a firearm. A traditional riding technique could be used with modern equipment. The result was an adaptable military culture. This adaptability helped Plains nations remain powerful even as the outside world changed. But there was a growing problem. The United States was also adapting. American armies were learning about the Plains. Military commanders were studying indigenous tactics. Soldiers were becoming more familiar with the landscape, and the federal government was building forts and roads. The railroad would eventually transform everything. Once rail lines crossed the plains, American soldiers could move supplies and reinforcements much faster. Settlers could travel west in enormous numbers, and buffalo hunters could reach herds that had once been difficult to access. The same transportation revolution that strengthened American expansion would weaken the economic foundations of Plains horse culture. But that future had not fully arrived yet. For now, the horse warriors still possessed enormous advantages. They knew the land, they knew their horses, they knew how to move, and they had generations of experience behind them. The open plains remained their greatest ally. But the horizon was changing. More fences were appearing. More settlements were being established. More trails were becoming roads. And more soldiers were arriving. The horse warriors had mastered the plains. Now they would have to confront a new challenge. An expanding nation determined to transform those same plains forever. The 19th century was bringing a new kind of pressure to the Great Plains. For generations, Plains nations had developed a world built around mobility. The buffalo provided food and materials. The grasslands provided grazing. The rivers provided water. And the horse connected everything. A rider could cross enormous distances. A hunting party could follow buffalo. A messenger could carry information. A warrior could respond to danger. The horse had made the plains smaller for those who knew how to use it. But now another power was entering that same landscape, the United States. At first, American traders and travelers were simply another group moving across the plains. They followed trails toward New Mexico. They traded manufactured goods. They encountered indigenous communities. And many quickly discovered that the plains were not empty. They were controlled by powerful nations with their own economies, political systems, and military traditions. But American expansion continued. Settlers wanted land. Merchants wanted reliable roads. The government wanted military control. And eventually railroads would connect the eastern United States with the West. This created a conflict that was very different from earlier struggles. The Plains horse warriors were accustomed to competing with neighboring nations. They understood their enemies. They knew the terrain. They knew how to negotiate and they knew when to fight. But the United States possessed something different. It could keep sending people west. If one military expedition failed, another could follow. If a fort was attacked, it could be rebuilt. If a settlement was destroyed, more settlers could arrive. And as the population increased, the amount of open land decreased. For Plains horse warriors, this was a serious problem. Their strength depended upon space. A horse needed grazing land. Buffalo needed enormous territories. Hunters needed freedom to follow the herds. And communities needed room to move. The American system increasingly depended on something very different. Fixed property, farms, ranches, towns, forts, roads, and eventually fences. These two visions of the plains were difficult to reconcile. The horse warrior could move across the landscape. The settler wanted to claim a specific piece of it. The conflict became increasingly intense. For the Comanche, this pressure was especially strong in the southern plains. Their territory was crossed by travelers moving toward New Mexico and Texas. Settlements expanded, ranches grew, and livestock increasingly competed with buffalo for grass. Comanche riders continued to use their mobility. They could travel far beyond the settlements. They could conduct raids. They could take horses and cattle, and they could return to the plains. But every raid produced a response. Settlers demanded protection. Militias organized. Soldiers were sent, and the cycle continued. The horse gave the Comanche extraordinary mobility, but the American population was growing faster than the Comanche could control. The same problem affected other plains nations. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, and many others were dealing with increasing settlement and military pressure. Yet there were also moments of diplomacy. Treaties were signed, representatives met, promises were made. Indigenous leaders attempted to protect their lands through negotiation. American officials sometimes promised that certain territories would remain indigenous lands, but these agreements were often undermined by continued settlement. A treaty might establish a boundary, then new settlers would cross it. Gold or other resources might be discovered. Pressure would increase, and the government might change its policy. This created deep distrust. For Plains peoples, agreements were supposed to mean something, but they repeatedly watched boundaries shift. This made peaceful relations increasingly difficult. At the same time, the horse remained central to indigenous resistance. A mounted warrior could move faster than many military units. He could travel across terrain that was difficult for wagons. He could live off the landscape. And he could choose when to engage. This frustrated American commanders. A military expedition might find an abandoned camp. The warriors had already moved. Soldiers could follow tracks, but the tracks might lead in several directions. A small mounted group could travel quickly and disappear. The plains were enormous. Even an army could struggle to control them. But the military was learning. American soldiers increasingly adopted specialized methods for campaigning in the West. They established forts. They mapped routes. They improved supply systems. And they learned to pursue indigenous groups for long periods. This changed the balance. The horse warriors still had extraordinary mobility, but the United States was beginning to develop its own form of mobility. Railroads, steamships, wagons, telegraph lines, and eventually large-scale military logistics. The technological gap was becoming increasingly important, yet perhaps the most important change was happening to the buffalo. For centuries, enormous herds had covered the plains. They were essential to indigenous life, but commercial hunting began destroying them on a massive scale. Buffalo hides became valuable. Hunters traveled westward. Railroads transported hides to distant markets, and thousands upon thousands of animals were killed. The effect on plains societies was devastating. The horse culture depended heavily on buffalo. Without buffalo, the traditional hunting economy weakened, families had less food, trade goods became harder to obtain, and communities became increasingly dependent on government supplies. This created a terrible contradiction. The horse had helped make plains nations powerful, but the destruction of the buffalo was undermining the very economy that supported that power. The United States now possessed another advantage. It did not need to defeat every mounted warrior in battle. If the economic foundation of the plains disappeared, resistance would become much harder. By the 1870s, this strategy was becoming painfully clear. The buffalo herds were collapsing, railroads were expanding, settlers were spreading, and military forces were increasing. Yet the horse warriors did not simply surrender. Resistance continued. The Red River War of 1874 and 1875 became one of the major final conflicts between the United States and the Southern Plains peoples. Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and other indigenous communities faced a powerful American military campaign. Their motivations were understandable. They wanted to protect their way of life. They wanted access to buffalo. They wanted freedom of movement, and they wanted to remain independent. The American military, however, had advantages that previous enemies had never possessed. It could sustain long campaigns. It could receive supplies by railroad. It could reinforce units, and it could continue advancing even after individual setbacks. The horse warriors fought with remarkable skill. They knew the terrain. They could move rapidly. They could avoid direct confrontation when necessary, but their options were shrinking. The buffalo were disappearing. The open land was disappearing, and the military pressure was increasing. Eventually, many Southern Plains peoples were forced onto reservations. For the horse warriors, this was more than a military defeat. It was the destruction of the environment that had made their way of life possible. The horse was still there, but without open land and abundant buffalo, the horse could no longer support the same society. The warrior culture that had developed over generations was being transformed. Yet even as the great era of mounted warfare ended, the skills and traditions did not disappear completely. Horsemanship remained important. Horses remained part of cultural identity. Stories about famous riders continued, and the memory of the buffalo hunt survived through generations. The United States had conquered the plains militarily, but it had not erased the people who had mastered them. The great horse warrior era was coming to an end, yet its legacy was only beginning, because the descendants of those riders would carry their stories into a completely different world. And the next chapter would ask a difficult question. What happens to a horse culture when the open plains disappear? The great era of the plains horse warrior was beginning to fade. The buffalo herds were disappearing. The open grasslands were being divided. Railroads were crossing territories that had once seemed endless, and American settlements were spreading farther west. For the peoples who had built their societies around horses, buffalo, and mobility, the changes were enormous. But the story of the horse did not end with the closing of the frontier. In many ways, A new chapter was beginning. The horse remained, and so did the knowledge. For generations, Plains peoples had developed an extraordinary understanding of horses. They knew how to train them, how to breed them, how to care for them, how to select the right animal for hunting, travel, or carrying heavy loads. They understood the land that supported them. They understood water, grass, weather, and distance. That knowledge could not simply disappear because the political world had changed. Instead, it was adapted. One of the most important changes was the transition from the old hunting economy to ranching. The buffalo could no longer provide the foundation of life, but cattle could. Horses could still be used to manage herds. Riders could still cross open country, and skills developed during the horse warrior era could be applied to a new economy. The ranch became, in some places, a new version of the plains. The buffalo hunt had required riders to understand animals and terrain. Ranching required many of the same skills. A rider needed to control a horse. They needed to understand livestock. They needed to travel long distances, and they needed to work with the land. The purpose had changed, but the knowledge remained useful. For some indigenous families, ranching became an important source of income. Horses remained central. Children continued learning to ride. Families continued raising animals. And the relationship between people and horses survived into the modern era. This is an important part of the story because the horse culture of the plains was never simply about warfare. It was also about competence. A skilled horseman possessed knowledge that could be used in many different circumstances. He could hunt, travel, trade, work cattle, carry messages, and care for animals. When warfare disappeared, those skills could find new purposes. The same was true of horse breeding. Plains communities had developed preferences for certain qualities in horses: speed, strength, endurance, temperament, and reliability. Those qualities remained valuable. A good horse was still a good horse. The world had changed, but the animal had not. Young people continued learning from older riders. A child might still be taught how to approach a horse, how to saddle it, how to guide it, how to recognize when an animal was tired, and how to remain calm when the horse became nervous. These lessons were practical, but they were also cultural. They connected younger generations to ancestors who had spent their lives on horseback. A horse could therefore become a bridge between centuries. The 19th century warrior and the 20th century rancher might live in very different worlds, but both understood the importance of a well-trained horse. Both understood the land, and both understood that mobility required responsibility. Meanwhile, the American public was developing its own fascination with the plains horse warrior. Stories spread about famous indigenous riders. Travelers wrote about mounted hunts. Artists painted dramatic scenes. And eventually, motion pictures transformed these images into popular entertainment. But these representations often simplified the reality. Hollywood created a version of the American West filled with dramatic battles, cavalry charges, and stereotyped indigenous characters. The complex societies behind those images were often forgotten. The real horse cultures were much richer. They included families, trade, diplomacy, religion, agriculture, hunting, art, and sophisticated political relationships. The warrior was only one part of the community. And even within warrior culture, courage was not simply about fighting. It could involve protecting others, showing generosity, taking responsibility, or demonstrating skill. The popular image of the plains warrior often missed these details. Modern generations began challenging those stereotypes. Historians and tribal scholars started documenting indigenous perspectives. Artists created their own representations, and families preserved stories that had been passed down orally. The horse became part of this process. Photographs of older riders became valuable historical records. Stories about famous horses were preserved, traditional riding practices were remembered, and cultural events kept equestrian traditions visible. The horse became a symbol of continuity, not because the past could be recreated exactly, but because something important had survived. The relationship between people and horses. That relationship had begun centuries earlier. It had transformed hunting. It had transformed travel. It had transformed trade. It had transformed warfare. And now it was helping carry culture into the modern world. But the transition was not easy. Reservation life brought government restrictions. Land was lost. Economic opportunities were often limited. And traditional practices were sometimes discouraged. Children were sent to schools where they were taught that their ancestral culture belonged to the past. Some were punished for speaking their languages. Others were separated from their families. The goal of assimilation was to create a generation that would abandon traditional identity. Yet the plan did not completely succeed. Families continued teaching, elders continued remembering, and traditions survived in places officials could not easily control. The horse was one of those traditions. Even when the government wanted indigenous people to become farmers or laborers, the horse remained familiar. It remained useful. It remained meaningful. And it remained connected to identity. Over time, Native communities began reclaiming more control over their cultural education. Young people became interested in the stories of their grandparents. They asked questions. They learned traditional arts. They studied history. And some returned to equestrian traditions. Horse events became opportunities to celebrate heritage. Rodeos and cultural gatherings could bring together families and communities. Young riders could learn skills that had been passed down through generations. The horse once again became a teacher. It taught patience, balance, responsibility, and confidence. These qualities had been essential to the great riders of the plains. They remained valuable long after warfare had ended. The legacy of the horse warrior, therefore, cannot be measured simply by military victories. The greater legacy was cultural. The plains peoples had taken an animal introduced by Europeans and transformed it into a foundation of their own societies. They developed unique systems of horse management. They created remarkable riding techniques. They incorporated horses into hunting, trade, travel, and warfare, and they passed that knowledge through generations. That was a form of innovation. It was also a form of cultural adaptation. The horse had not erased indigenous traditions. It had become part of them. And when the world changed again, the traditions changed with it. By the 20th century, the great mounted warfare of the plains was history. But the horse remained a living connection to that history. A rider sitting on a horse today might not be preparing for battle. He might be working cattle, competing in a rodeo, participating in a cultural gathering, or simply riding across the land. Yet the movements of the horse can still echo those of earlier generations. The same understanding of balance, the same patience, the same attention to the animal, and the same awareness of the landscape. This is why the story of the plains horse warrior should not end with defeat. The military era ended. The open frontier ended. But the knowledge survived. And survival is often more complicated than victory. The horse warriors had lost the world that created their power, but they carried parts of that world forward through families, through stories, through horses, and through memory. The next generation would face an even greater challenge. How could they preserve this heritage in a modern world where cars, cities, highways, and technology had replaced much of the old landscape? The answer would come through cultural revival, through education, through art, through language, and through the decision of young people to look backward before moving forward. The great horse warrior era had ended. The open plains were changing. Railroads crossed the grasslands. Towns expanded. Fences appeared. The buffalo had almost disappeared, and the old freedom of movement had been replaced by reservation boundaries and private property. Yet the knowledge of the horse remained. It survived in families. It survived in stories. And it survived in the hands of young riders, learning from older generations. This was perhaps one of the most remarkable parts of the story. The horse had arrived from another continent. Indigenous peoples had transformed it into something deeply connected to their own cultures. And when the world around them changed, they transformed that relationship again. The horse was no longer primarily a tool of warfare. It became a connection to heritage, a connection to family, and a connection to the land. For many Plains communities, this connection was especially important because so much of the old world had disappeared. The buffalo herds were gone. Traditional hunting territories had been divided, and many families had been separated from older ways of life. But a horse could still provide something tangible. A child could learn to ride, an elder could teach that child, a family could raise horses, and a tradition could continue. The knowledge passed from one generation to another was not always written down. It was learned through experience. Watch carefully, listen, try, make mistakes, try again. This was how horsemanship had been taught for generations, and it remained effective. A young rider learned how to approach an animal, how to recognize its mood, how to saddle it, how to guide it, how to care for it, and eventually how to ride with confidence. These lessons were about more than horses. They taught patience, responsibility, observation, and respect. Those values were part of the deeper legacy of Plains horse culture. The great horse warrior had not simply been someone who could ride quickly. He had been someone who understood the animal beneath him. He understood the environment around him. He understood distance, and he understood timing. These same qualities remained useful in peaceful life. A rancher needed patience. A horse trainer needed observation. A rider needed balance. And a community needed people who could pass knowledge forward. The horse, therefore, became part of cultural continuity. It connected the modern world with the older one. But cultural survival involved more than horses. Language became increasingly important. For generations, boarding schools and assimilation policies had discouraged native languages. Children were often taught that English was the language of education and opportunity. Some were punished for speaking the languages of their families. As a result, many indigenous languages became endangered. Plains languages faced this pressure as well. Comanche, Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, and many others experienced declining numbers of fluent speakers. But by the later 20th century, communities increasingly recognized the importance of revitalization. Elders became teachers. Language programs were created. Historical recordings were preserved. And younger people began asking questions about the words their grandparents had spoken. The revival of language became a form of cultural strength. A language does more than name objects. It carries relationships, stories, humor, memory, and ways of understanding the natural world. When a young person learns an ancestral language, they are not simply memorizing vocabulary. They are gaining access to another way of seeing. The same was true of traditional stories. Stories about the buffalo, stories about ancestors, stories about famous riders, stories about difficult journeys, and stories about survival. For a long time, many of these stories were known mainly within families, but modern technology created new ways to preserve them. Audio recordings could preserve the voices of elders, video could document ceremonies and traditional skills. Photographs could be archived, and digital collections could make historical materials accessible to younger generations. Technology, which once seemed like a symbol of cultural change, could now become a tool for cultural preservation. A young person could live in a modern city and still listen to an elder telling a story recorded decades earlier. They could learn traditional history through a computer. They could study old photographs, and they could reconnect with their community from hundreds of miles away. The world had changed, but connection was still possible. Education also became an important part of this transformation. For much of American history, education had been used to assimilate indigenous people, but Native communities increasingly demanded greater control over what their children learned. They wanted young people to receive strong academic education, but they also wanted them to learn their own history, their languages, their traditions, and the experiences of their ancestors. This created a new idea of education. Learning did not have to mean abandoning identity. A student could study mathematics, science, literature, technology, and still learn traditional knowledge. They could become a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, a teacher, or a scientist, while remaining deeply connected to their native nation. This was another form of adaptation. The Plains peoples had always adapted. The horse itself was proof. They had encountered a new animal and transformed their societies around it. Now they were encountering an entirely new technological world: cars, airplanes, telephones, computers, the internet. The challenge was not whether to reject all of these things. It was whether they could be used without losing cultural identity. Increasingly, the answer was yes. Modern technology could carry traditional knowledge. Modern education could strengthen tribal governments. Modern law could be used to defend treaty rights. And modern businesses could support communities. The old world did not have to be recreated. It could be remembered. This distinction was important. There was no realistic way to restore the 18th century plains exactly as they had been. The buffalo herds had changed. The landscape had changed. Political borders had changed. The United States had become a modern industrial nation, but cultural identity did not depend upon recreating the past perfectly. It depended upon continuity. A tradition could evolve, a language could adapt, a ceremony could survive in a new setting, a horse culture could continue without mounted warfare, and a story could be told through a modern recording instead of around a traditional camp. The form might change, the meaning could remain. This was particularly visible in the relationship between Native communities and horses. Modern riders might participate in rodeos. They might work cattle. They might compete in equestrian events. Or they might simply ride for enjoyment. But the skills remained connected to older traditions. The ability to read a horse, to maintain balance, to understand movement, to travel confidently, and to care for an animal. These were skills that had been developed long before automobiles replaced horses as the primary form of transportation. And every generation that continued practicing them kept a small part of the old world alive. The horse, therefore, became more than a historical symbol. It became a living tradition, a bridge between the warrior and the rancher, between the buffalo hunter and the modern rider, between the 19th century and the 21st. And perhaps that is why the image of the Plains rider remains so powerful. It represents freedom, but also responsibility, speed, but also patience, strength, but also cooperation. The rider cannot succeed without the horse, and the horse cannot understand the journey without the rider. Their relationship is built on trust. That relationship had once helped indigenous peoples transform the Great Plains, and now it was helping preserve a connection to the past. The greatest horse warriors were no longer riding into battle. They did not need to. Their greatest legacy was not the battles they won. It was the knowledge they left behind. The knowledge of horses, the knowledge of the land, the knowledge of movement, and the knowledge that a people can encounter enormous change without losing everything that makes them who they are. The Plains had changed, but the story was still moving, and the next chapter would look more closely at the nations that became especially famous for their horse cultures, and the different ways each one turned the horse into a source of power, identity, and survival. The story of the Plains horse warriors was never the story of a single nation. Across the enormous grasslands of North America, many indigenous peoples developed powerful equestrian traditions. The Comanche became famous across the southern plains. The Lakota became masters of mounted hunting farther north. The Cheyenne and Arapaho developed their own traditions of horsemanship and warfare. The Kiowa became renowned for their horses and mounted skills. The Crow were famous for their knowledge of horses, and many other nations incorporated horses into their lives in ways that reflected their own environments and traditions. Each nation had its own history, its own language, its own political system, and its own relationship with the horse. Yet there were similarities. The horse provided mobility. It expanded hunting territory. It carried possessions. It supported trade, and it could transform warfare. This shared technology created a remarkable network across the plains. Horses moved between communities. So did knowledge. A rider could see another nation's technique and adapt it. A horse trader could introduce an animal with qualities that were highly valued elsewhere. A captured horse could become part of another herd, and a young person could learn skills from people outside their immediate community. The plains were therefore constantly exchanging ideas. But among all these horse cultures, the Comanche became especially powerful. Their rise was closely connected to geography. The southern plains offered enormous grasslands. Buffalo were abundant, and the terrain allowed horses to move quickly over long distances. The Comanche took advantage of all of these conditions. They developed large horse herds. They became exceptional mounted hunters, and they used their mobility to expand their influence. Their territory, often described as the Comanchería, covered a vast portion of the southern plains. It was not an empire in the European sense. There was no single capital controlling every community. Instead, Comanche power came from independent bands connected through family, trade, diplomacy, and shared identity. This decentralized structure could make them difficult for outside governments to understand. There was no single leader who could always speak for every Comanche community, but there were respected leaders within individual bands. They could negotiate, they could make agreements, and they could organize resistance. The horse supported this political flexibility. A band could move when necessary. It could follow buffalo. It could avoid military pressure, and it could maintain connections with distant communities. This mobility became one of the greatest sources of Comanche power. Farther north, the Lakota were developing their own extraordinary relationship with horses. Their movement onto the plains transformed their economy. The horse made buffalo hunting more efficient. It allowed camps to move more easily, and it created new possibilities for warfare. Lakota riders could travel across enormous territories. They developed specialized knowledge of the plains. They understood where buffalo could be found. They knew water sources. They understood weather, and they became deeply connected to the environment around them. The horse was therefore not simply transportation. It was part of a complete way of life. The same could be said of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Both developed powerful mounted cultures. Their societies were organized around family, community, hunting, diplomacy, and seasonal movement. Horses made all of these activities easier. A family could move more possessions. Hunters could travel farther. Warriors could respond quickly. And messengers could travel between distant groups. The Kiowa developed another distinctive horse culture. Their history connected them to both the southern plains and the broader networks of the Southwest. They became skilled buffalo hunters and mounted warriors. Their horses were an important part of their wealth and social life. The Crow, farther north, became renowned for their horses as well. Their position along important trade routes allowed them to participate in extensive exchanges. They acquired horses and developed a reputation for exceptional horsemanship. Their relationship with neighboring nations was complex. They could trade with one group and fight another. They could form alliances, and they could change their political relationships as circumstances changed. This reminds us that the plains were not divided into permanent teams. Relationships shifted. A nation could be an enemy in one period and a trading partner in another. People could exchange horses even when political relations were tense, and diplomatic gatherings could bring together people who sometimes fought. The horse moved through all of these relationships. It was both a source of competition and a source of connection. The economic importance of horses was enormous. A large herd represented wealth, but horses were also useful because they could be exchanged. A horse could be traded for buffalo robes, for metal tools, for firearms, for clothing, for other horses, or for goods from distant markets. This helped create an indigenous trade economy that connected the plains to Mexico, the Southwest, and eventually the United States. The horse, therefore, became part of a larger continental economy. But the greatest expression of horse culture remained hunting. Buffalo hunting from horseback required extraordinary coordination. The rider had to control the horse. The hunter had to understand the buffalo, and the two had to move together. A skilled rider could approach a herd without causing unnecessary panic. They could follow an animal. They could reposition quickly, and they could return safely. These skills were not learned from books. They were taught through experience. A child watched, then practiced, then made mistakes, then tried again. Over years, the movements became natural. This was how extraordinary horsemanship was created. It was a form of education that took place outdoors, on the grasslands, beside the herd, among horses, and within families. The knowledge of horses could also become knowledge of the environment. A rider who understood horses needed to understand grass, water, weather, distance, and terrain. They needed to know where animals could survive, where a herd could be hidden, where a camp could be established, and where a journey could safely continue. This deep environmental knowledge was one of the greatest strengths of plains societies. It is easy to look at a mounted warrior and focus only on the rider, but behind that rider was an entire civilization of knowledge. People who knew how to make equipment, people who cared for horses, people who prepared food, people who processed buffalo hides, people who maintained camps, people who raised children, and people who preserved stories. The horse warrior could not exist without that larger community. This is why the image of a lone rider crossing the plains can sometimes be misleading. The rider was part of a network, a family, a band, a nation, a trade system, and a cultural tradition. The horse was woven through all of it. Eventually, outsiders began to recognize just how powerful these mounted cultures had become. Spanish officials in the Southwest encountered Comanche riders. Mexican settlements experienced Comanche raids. American travelers described plains horsemen with a mixture of admiration and fear. Military officers struggled to control enormous territories where mounted indigenous peoples could move with extraordinary speed. The horse had transformed the balance of power, but that balance would not last forever. The United States was developing railroads, its population was expanding, and its military was becoming more experienced in Western warfare. The buffalo herds were collapsing, the open land was being divided, and the economic foundation of the horse cultures was weakening. The greatest horse warriors had mastered the plains, but the plains themselves were changing. Soon the challenge would no longer be how to become a better rider, but how to survive when the world that had created the great horse cultures was disappearing, and that final transformation would change the history of North America forever. The great horse cultures of the plains had reached their height. For generations, horses had carried hunters across the grasslands. They had pulled travois. They had carried messages. They had transported families. And they had carried warriors into some of the most remarkable mounted conflicts in North American history. But the world that had created those horse cultures was beginning to disappear. The change was gradual at first. A new settlement here, a military fort there, a wagon road crossing the grassland, a few fences appearing along a river. Then came the railroads. And with them came a transformation that the horse warriors could not easily stop. The railroad changed distance once again. For centuries, the horse had made the plains smaller for indigenous peoples. Now the railroad was making the continent smaller for American settlers and armies. Troops could be transported more quickly. Supplies could arrive from distant cities. Settlers could travel west in greater numbers, and commercial hunters could reach areas that had once been difficult to access. The horse was still fast, but the railroad could move an enormous number of people and supplies. This created a new kind of power. The Plains nations were accustomed to dealing with neighboring communities. They could move away from danger. They could relocate their camps. They could follow buffalo, but they could not simply move the entire plains away from a railroad. The railroad stayed. The settlements stayed. The fences stayed. And slowly the open spaces became smaller. For the Comanche, this transformation was especially devastating. Their power had depended heavily upon mobility and access to the southern plains. The buffalo were central to their economy. Their horses allowed them to follow the herds. Their mobility allowed them to trade and conduct warfare across enormous distances. But the buffalo were being destroyed. Commercial hunters killed enormous numbers of animals for their hides. Railroads made it easier to transport those hides to distant markets. The destruction was so extensive that entire herds disappeared from landscapes where they had once seemed endless. For the Comanche, this was more than an environmental disaster. It was the collapse of an economic system. The horse could still run, but what would the horse carry? The buffalo that had fed families were disappearing. The hides that had supported trade were becoming scarce, and the open territories needed for traditional hunting were being occupied. The same transformation was occurring farther north. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, and other plains nations were watching their hunting grounds shrink. Some continued to resist, others negotiated. Many tried to use treaties to protect their territories, but the pressure from American expansion continued. The United States wanted land. Settlers wanted farms and ranches. Railroad companies wanted routes, and military leaders wanted control. The result was a conflict between two very different understandings of the plains. For many indigenous nations, land was part of a living homeland. It was connected to hunting, travel, ceremony, family, and memory. For the expanding American economy, land increasingly became property. It could be divided, bought, sold, fenced, and developed. The two systems could exist side by side only with difficulty, and the balance of power was changing rapidly. The United States had growing numbers of soldiers. It had industrial manufacturing, it had railroads, it had a large population, and it could sustain military campaigns for long periods. The Plains nations had horses, knowledge of the landscape, highly skilled riders, and generations of experience. But their resources were becoming harder to replace. A horse could be bred, a rider could be trained, but a destroyed buffalo herd could not quickly return. A lost hunting ground could not simply be recreated. This was the deeper problem. The American military did not necessarily need to defeat every mounted warrior in a traditional battle. It could attack the conditions that allowed the horse warrior world to exist, control the land, restrict movement, destroy or control access to food, establish military posts, and force communities onto reservations. The final campaigns of the Southern Plains demonstrated this strategy. During the Red River War of 1874 and 1875, Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and other indigenous peoples faced sustained military pressure. Their resistance was determined. They knew the landscape. They could travel quickly. They could avoid direct encounters when necessary, and their horses remained extremely valuable. But the conditions were changing. The buffalo were disappearing. Military forces were increasing, and the available territory was shrinking. The horse warriors were fighting to protect more than land. They were fighting to preserve a way of life built around movement, a way of life in which families followed seasonal resources, a way of life in which horses and buffalo were central, a way of life in which the horizon remained open. The United States increasingly demanded something different: permanent settlement, agriculture, fixed communities, and federal control. Eventually, resistance became increasingly difficult. Many Southern Plains peoples were forced onto reservations. The transition was painful. The horse warrior, who had once traveled hundreds of miles freely, could now face restrictions on where he could go. The hunter who had once followed buffalo could no longer depend upon enormous herds. The family that had once moved with the seasons was expected to remain in one place. The entire rhythm of life had been changed, yet even here, the horse remained. This is one of the most fascinating parts of the story. The United States could restrict movement. It could control land. It could destroy the buffalo economy, but it could not erase generations of knowledge about horses. A Comanche child could still learn to ride. A Lakota family could still maintain horses. A Cheyenne or Arapaho rider could still understand an animal's movements. The old skills survived even when their original purpose had disappeared, and that survival mattered because the horse had become more than a military tool. It had become part of identity. The rider sitting on a horse represented a connection to ancestors. The animal represented freedom, skill, responsibility, and memory. The great horse warriors were being forced into a new world, but they carried their knowledge with them. Some became ranchers, some worked with livestock, some participated in rodeos, some continued raising horses. Others focused on preserving family traditions and stories. The horse found new roles, and the people adapted again. This ability to adapt had been present from the beginning. When horses first arrived, Plains peoples had not simply copied European ways of riding. They had developed their own, they had experimented, they had created techniques suited to buffalo hunting and open country warfare. They had built social systems around horses. And when the frontier disappeared, they adapted those systems once more. The military horse warrior had become a symbol of the past, but the horseman remained. This distinction is important. The end of mounted warfare did not mean the end of Plains horsemanship. It meant the beginning of another chapter. The horse would continue to appear at cultural gatherings, at ranches, at rodeos, in family stories, in artwork, and in photographs. Young riders would continue learning from elders. The old skills would be adapted to modern life, and the horse would become one of the strongest living connections between the present and the past. Meanwhile, the image of the Plains horse warrior was becoming part of American mythology. Paintings showed riders crossing dramatic landscapes. Books described famous battles. Later, films created romanticized versions of the Old West, but these images often missed the deeper story. The horse warrior was not simply a figure of violence. He was part of a sophisticated society. He was a hunter, a family member, a trader, a messenger, a protector, and a person with responsibilities to his community. The horse itself was not simply a weapon. It was a partner, a source of wealth, a means of transportation, and a living creature that required knowledge and care. The true story was therefore far richer than the mythology. The great horse warriors of the plains had achieved something extraordinary. They had taken an animal introduced from another continent and created one of the most remarkable equestrian cultures in North American history. But their greatest achievement may not have been their military skill. It may have been their ability to adapt. They had adapted to horses, to new weapons, to changing trade networks, to foreign governments, and finally to the loss of the world that had created their horse culture. The plains were no longer the same. The buffalo were nearly gone. The railroads had arrived. The fences had spread. The open frontier was closing. But the people remained, and with them remained the memory of what had once existed. The next chapter would explore what happened after the frontier closed, and how the descendants of the great horse warriors carried their traditions into the modern world. The frontier had closed. The great buffalo herds were mostly gone. The railroads had crossed the plains. And the horse warriors, who had once traveled freely across enormous territories, were now living in a very different world. Yet the story of the horse did not end. In many ways, this was when its deepest meaning became visible. For generations, the horse had been a source of mobility, wealth, food, trade, and military power. Now it became something else, a connection to memory, a connection to family, and a connection to identity. The United States had attempted to transform indigenous societies through reservation policies and assimilation. Children were sent to boarding schools. Traditional languages were discouraged. Ceremonies were sometimes restricted. And young people were often taught that their ancestral cultures belonged to the past. But cultural traditions proved difficult to erase. They survived in homes, in families, in stories, and sometimes they survived through horses. A child who learned to ride was learning something their ancestors had also learned. The child might never see a buffalo herd. They might never travel across hundreds of miles of open plains. They might never experience the world of the 19th century warrior, but they could still feel the movement of the horse beneath them. They could still learn patience, balance, control, and responsibility. The horse became a bridge across time. For some families, ranching offered a new way to continue using those skills. The old buffalo hunter had needed to understand animals. The rancher needed to understand cattle. The old warrior had needed to understand horses. The modern rider still needed to understand horses. The landscape and purpose had changed. The underlying knowledge remained. Ranching became an important part of life for some native communities. Horses and cattle could provide income. Families could remain connected to rural land, and younger generations could learn practical skills from their elders. The horse was no longer carrying warriors into battle. It was carrying riders across ranches. But that did not make the tradition meaningless. It showed how adaptable the culture had always been. The Plains peoples had never been frozen in one moment of history. They had changed when horses arrived. They had changed when firearms became common. They had changed when trade patterns shifted. And now they were changing again. The modern world brought automobiles, trucks, airplanes, telephones, television, and eventually computers and the internet. Cars made horses unnecessary for transportation, but horses remained important for cultural reasons. That distinction mattered. A person no longer needed a horse to travel across the plains, but they might still choose to ride one. Not because it was the fastest way to get somewhere, but because it connected them to something older. This became especially visible at cultural gatherings. Horses could appear in parades, rodeos, community celebrations, traditional events, and family gatherings. Young riders could learn skills from older relatives. The horse could once again become a teacher. It could teach confidence, discipline, patience, and respect for another living creature. These qualities had always been valuable. The horse warrior had needed them. The hunter had needed them. The rancher needed them. And the modern rider still needed them. At the same time, communities were working to preserve another essential part of their heritage: language. The languages spoken by Plains peoples had faced enormous pressure. English-dominated schools, government, business, and popular culture. Many children grew up speaking English rather than the language of their ancestors. As older fluent speakers passed away, communities realized that valuable knowledge could disappear with them. So language preservation became increasingly important. Elders became teachers. Recordings were made. Classes were created. Words were documented. And younger people began rediscovering languages that had once been discouraged. The connection between language and history was profound. A traditional word could contain a concept that did not translate perfectly into English. A place name could preserve an ancient memory. A phrase could reveal something about relationships, animals, or the natural world. Language was therefore not simply communication. It was a cultural map, and protecting it meant protecting another part of the old world. Stories were equally important. For centuries, knowledge had been passed through storytelling. Stories about ancestors, stories about animals, stories about difficult journeys, stories about courage, stories about mistakes, and stories about survival. These stories helped younger generations understand who they were. Modern technology created new ways to preserve them. An elder could be recorded speaking, photographs could be digitized, historical documents could be archived, and young people could access materials from anywhere. Technology had once seemed like a force of cultural disruption. Now it could become a tool for cultural preservation. This was another example of adaptation. The Plains peoples had taken the horse and transformed it. Now they were taking modern technology and finding ways to use it for their own purposes. Education also changed. For decades, schools had often been used to separate Native children from their cultures. But Indigenous communities increasingly demanded greater control over education. They wanted children to learn mathematics and science. They wanted them to prepare for careers, but they also wanted them to learn their own histories, their languages, their traditions, and the experiences of their ancestors. A student did not have to choose between modern education and cultural identity. They could become a doctor while speaking an ancestral language. They could become an engineer while learning traditional stories. They could study law while defending tribal sovereignty. They could use modern technology while preserving traditional knowledge. This was a new form of strength, the ability to participate fully in the modern world without abandoning identity. And perhaps nowhere was this more visible than in the younger generation. Young Native people began asking different questions. Who were our ancestors? What did they know? What did they lose? What survived? And what can we bring forward? The answers were not always easy. Some traditions had been severely weakened. Some languages had very few fluent speakers. Some historical knowledge had been lost, but other traditions remained surprisingly strong. Family connections, ceremonies, art, stories, horse culture, and a strong sense of belonging. The old warrior world could not be restored. The buffalo could not simply be brought back to the 19th century. The frontier could not be reopened. And perhaps that was not the goal. The goal was continuity, to preserve what mattered, while allowing culture to live in the present. This was the true legacy of the horse. It had never been simply about warfare. The horse had taught Plains peoples how to adapt. It had expanded their world. It had created new economic opportunities. It had transformed hunting. It had changed warfare, and eventually it became a symbol of survival. The great horse warriors were gone, but their descendants remained, and the skills they developed had not disappeared completely. They lived in the rider who understood a horse's temperament, in the family that continued raising horses, in the artist who painted a mounted ancestor, in the elder who told stories about the old days, and in the child who listened. That child represented something important. The story was not ending. It was being passed forward. The world of the horse warrior had once seemed limitless. Then it almost disappeared, but the memory survived. And sometimes memory is enough to build a bridge into the future. The final chapter of our journey would therefore not be about the death of the horse warrior. It would be about his legacy, about how the descendants of the great riders remembered the past, and how that memory continues to shape the plains today. And so our journey across the Great Plains comes to an end. But perhaps it is better to say that it reaches a resting place, because the story of the great horse warriors never truly ended. The horses are still here, the people are still here, and the memories are still being carried from one generation to another. Centuries ago, the plains looked very different. There were no railroads, no highways, no fences stretching across the horizon, no modern cities rising above the grasslands. Instead, there were enormous buffalo herds, wide rivers, open prairies, mountain ranges in the distance, and indigenous communities who understood this environment in extraordinary detail. Then came the horse, an animal that had disappeared from North America thousands of years earlier, returned through European colonization. At first, the horse was simply something new, but indigenous peoples did not remain passive observers. They experimented, they learned, they adapted. and they transformed the horse into something that belonged within their own societies. The horse changed everything. It changed how people hunted. It changed how they traveled. It changed how they traded. It changed how they moved their camps. It changed how wealth was measured, and eventually changed warfare. Across the plains, generations of young people learned the skills necessary to become exceptional riders. They learned how to train horses, how to care for them, how to recognize their personalities, how to control them, and how to work with them rather than simply command them. The greatest riders did not appear overnight. Their abilities were built through years of practice. A child watched an elder, then tried, then failed, then tried again. Eventually, balance became natural, movement became instinctive, and the horse became a trusted partner. This was the foundation of plains horsemanship. It was not simply physical skill, it was knowledge. Knowledge of animals, knowledge of weather, knowledge of water, knowledge of terrain, knowledge of distance, and knowledge of the seasons. The rider understood the horse, the rider understood the land, and the rider understood the animals being hunted. Together, these skills produced some of the most extraordinary mounted hunters in North American history. The buffalo hunt demonstrated this perfectly. A skilled rider could move alongside a massive herd. He could read its movements, he could control his horse, and he could react instantly when the animals changed direction. The horse allowed hunters to travel farther and hunt more efficiently. It helped support communities across enormous territories, and it became deeply connected to the buffalo-centered economies of the plains. Then came warfare. The same mobility that made a hunter effective also made a mounted warrior formidable. A rider could approach quickly, move away, change direction, cross difficult terrain, and use the enormous openness of the plains to his advantage. The Comanche became famous for this. So did the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Kiowa, the Crow, and many other plains nations. They were not one people. They did not share one government. They did not always share the same goals. And they were sometimes enemies, but they shared an extraordinary ability to adapt the horse to their own cultures. The horse became a source of power, but it also became a source of connection. Horses were traded, given as gifts, exchanged between families, passed from one generation to another, and sometimes taken during raids. A large horse herd could represent enormous wealth, but generosity could also create prestige. A respected person might give horses to relatives or allies. The animals moved through social networks, and with them moved relationships. The plains, therefore, became a world connected by horses, but that world could not last forever. The United States expanded westward. Settlers arrived, railroads crossed the plains, forts were established, and the open landscape became increasingly divided. Most devastating of all, the buffalo disappeared. The animal that had supported plains life for generations was slaughtered on an enormous scale. For many indigenous communities, the destruction of the buffalo was not simply an environmental tragedy. It was the destruction of a way of life. Without buffalo, traditional hunting became increasingly difficult. Without open hunting grounds, mobility lost much of its meaning. Without freedom of movement, the horse could no longer support the same society. The great horse warrior era therefore came to an end, not because indigenous horsemanship suddenly disappeared, but because the world that had made it possible was being dismantled. The Comanche were forced onto reservations. The Lakota and other plains nations experienced similar transformations. Families were separated. Children were sent to boarding schools. Traditional languages were discouraged. And government policies attempted to replace indigenous cultures with an American way of life. Yet the story did not end there. because people remembered. They remembered songs, stories, names, places, family histories, and horses. The horse became one of the living links to the past. A young rider could still learn skills from an elder. A family could still raise horses. A community could still celebrate its equestrian traditions. The old purpose might be gone, but the knowledge remained. That is the deeper story of adaptation. The Plains peoples had adapted when the horse arrived. They adapted when firearms became common. They adapted when trade networks changed. They adapted when colonial powers expanded. And they adapted again when the frontier disappeared. They did not need to recreate the 18th century. They needed to carry the most important parts of it forward. That meant language, family, memory, community, and cultural identity. Today, descendants of the Great Plains horse cultures live in a world of cars, airplanes, smartphones, universities, businesses, cities, and modern governments. But modern life does not automatically erase ancient connections. A person can use a smartphone and still learn an ancestral language. They can work in a modern profession and still participate in cultural ceremonies. They can live in a contemporary home and still raise horses. They can study American history while also learning the history of their own nation. The past and present can exist together. That may be the greatest lesson of the horse warriors. They were never simply people who mastered an animal. They were people who mastered adaptation. They took something unfamiliar and made it their own. They took the possibilities offered by the horse and created new societies around them. They turned speed into mobility, mobility into economic power into political influence, and horsemanship into a cultural tradition. Their achievements were extraordinary, but perhaps the most remarkable achievement was what came afterward. When the world they had created disappeared, they survived. The buffalo were gone. The open frontier was gone. The old military traditions were gone. But the people remained, and because they remained, the story remained. So when you picture the plains tonight, do not imagine only a warrior charging across the grasslands. Imagine the entire world behind him. Imagine the family preparing for a journey, the children learning to ride, the hunters watching the buffalo, the elders telling stories, the traders carrying goods between distant communities, the horses grazing beneath an enormous sky, and the rider looking toward the horizon, knowing that the land was vast, but never truly empty. It was a homeland, a place filled with memory, and the horse had become one of the ways that people moved through that homeland. From the first indigenous riders who experimented with the newly arrived animals, to the extraordinary mounted hunters and warriors of the 19th century, to the modern riders who continue traditions today, the journey has been one of adaptation. The horse changed the plains, but the plains peoples changed the horse as well. They gave it new meaning. They built relationships around it. They made it part of their cultures, and they carried that relationship through one of the most dramatic transformations in North American history. The greatest horse warriors are no longer riding across the plains in search of buffalo. Their world belongs to history, but their legacy remains in stories, in families, in art, in language, in cultural gatherings, and in every young rider who climbs onto a horse and feels, even for a moment, the movement of generations beneath them. The grasslands are quieter now. The great herds are mostly memories. The frontier has become modern America. But beneath the roads and fences, beneath the towns and cities, the old stories remain. And perhaps if you listen carefully enough, you can still imagine the sound of distant hooves moving across the night, not as the sound of a vanished world, but as a reminder that cultures can change without disappearing, that traditions can adapt without losing their meaning, and that history does not always live in monuments. Sometimes it lives in a story, sometimes it lives in a language, and sometimes it lives in the quiet bond between a rider and a horse. This is the legacy of the great horse warriors of the plains. Not simply conquest, not simply warfare, but adaptation, skill, memory, and survival. And that story continues.